Welcome to this edition of Africa 360. We are the current affairs show that really goes beyond the headlines to bring you what you won't see anywhere else. If it's about Africa, we'll be talking about it and bring it to you. I'm Chris Maruleng, and you're watching Africa 360. 2 weeks ago, we brought you a special show on foreign aid in Africa. It centered on a dialogue organized by the aid group Oxfam International. Some of the issues that came up include why the continent depends on foreign aid for most of its development, and of course how to break that cycle of dependency.
We don't want paternalism, but on the other hand, we want responsibility from our governments, and that speaks to the issue of active citizens.
This week, we continue our focus on foreign aid with part 2 of this dialogue. The focus this week now moves to Africa's industrialization, natural resources, and indeed, how it can become more self-sufficient. One of the key things that I must ask to move the debate forward is then why are we as African governments in the main not engaged in this development game, not developing our own agencies for overseas development assistance, or rather regional African development assistance?
I mean, some of us are trying to do some of that. Something like the establishment of the BRICS-led Development Bank, which was one of the big outcomes of the BRICS summit, which we held here. Not the work not completed, but was to try to find a way in which we could channel funds to meet things like infrastructure development across the African continent. Well, partly that would actually find the projects that we need to have them funded. There's a shortage of resources for infrastructure, particularly that connects us up, but also with less of a set of conditionalities that attach to that. I think those are some of the ideas that we tried to work around. And I think that I have the impression that a number of governments are trying, maybe there's a backlog, are trying to put in place models and delivery systems, particularly around industrial development, that are actually going to be new territory for some of us.
Winnie,
so we've got a fairly extensive industrial policy, and I think I hear quite a number of others who want to move in the same direction.
Yes.
Well, I want to agree with the minister, but also say that South Africa is in a more fortunate situation than the rest of Africa. He's touching on a very important point regarding the extractive industries. See, our continent is going to depend on the export of natural resources for the foreseeable future. We are resource rich as a continent, perhaps the richest continent. We don't have the technological edge, and most of our countries are going to be exporting oil or minerals or other natural resources like timber and so on for a long time to come. And we are not even at that point of negotiating for value added like South Africa. It's good that South Africa can argue for value addition, and that's the way to go. But my issue is that even as we export raw materials, that export revenue that we should get for our raw materials isn't coming. And that's not because of conditionalities. That is our own inability to collect our due revenues. And that's because of companies, foreign companies, that can't break their rules, these rules in their own countries. They dare not, but will break the rules in our weak countries with weak institutions. So this brings me back to the issue of aid and Charles's point, that if aid is well targeted, if we can use it to strengthen those economic governance institutions to make sure that our money for our resources stays here, that we collect our taxes, our royalties, and what. And the other issue is that there is really, on conditionalities, again to agree with the minister, is that there is a really race to the bottom on this issue of extractives, that with pressure from the World Bank, the IMF, and others, our governments are under pressure to make the conditions conducive for these foreign companies to come to extract.
I agree with what the minister is saying. Industrialization is an important way for us to make sure that we retain value of our mineral wealth on the continent. But to do that, we need to break down the barriers, stop acting like 54 countries, start to move towards regional integration, which means, Rob himself knows the biggest challenges we have of intra-African trade is all the trade barriers, the way our borders operate. And that requires political will to break that, not civil society or business. It requires governments to break down those rules and make sure that those ways of building a grid across Africa, making the Inga electricity project, the hydro project work, because it will supply Africa and Southern Europe. So we've got to make these big infrastructure projects work. Now, the example I can give you is telecommunications. In the mid-90s, when I was in government and as a minister of telecommunications, we had less phones in sub-Saharan Africa than the city of New York or Tokyo. Wow. Today, we are the fastest growing market, 600 million cellular phones. And today, those phones are being used to facilitate a whole range of applications. For example, M-Pesa in Kenya, that puts banking services in the reach of the poorest of the poor without having a banking account. So these things can happen. It happened with not one $8, but by policy, regulation, and the way we built the scale of the economy. Now, I'm saying we've got to do the same around industrialization. We are the fastest growing market, but name me one African brand of communications.
But here's the thing, and that's where I want to bring in Charles. Why, if it's your determination that there isn't political will to break down these barriers, boost intra-African trade amongst the leaders, why isn't it happening? Or is it happening, Charles?
There's a lot that can be done, but we have to recognize what has been done. The East African community is moving pretty fast, much faster than we thought it could do in integrating, in releasing the movement of trade and the free movement of people and goods. They are discussing a common currency. Some of us don't quite like it as an idea, but they are quite going fast. ECOWAS has a particular problem, for example. ECOWAS has a complexity of a linguistic problem and a long period of military, of conflicts in the region. This time, the conflict is a bit down. The linguistic differences are still there, but it can be tackled. After all, EcoBank came out of that system in spite of. The African Union strategy for this is get the regional bodies to gradually move the integration process forward before you bring it together. You can't do it without infrastructure, roads, railways. You can't quite do it without resources to make the ports work so that the harbors don't spend months and months and months clearing one container. You can't quite do it without electricity and power. There's a lot that has got to be done, but that's why we can't so easily say aid is not important. If countries can find concessionary loans, which is also called aid, to be able to expand power sources and expand roads, we should do it. But we should reject loans and aid that seek to manage an entire political system, an ideology. So it is a selectivity. Aid remains an important part of the movement towards that integration for some countries and some regions.
Our end goal is for this continent to become economically independent. Our political independence is not meaningful without economic independence.
It's a warm welcome back. If you're just joining us, this is Africa 360. This week, we bring you the second part of our discussion where we look into foreign aid on the African continent. In this segment, we find out from our panel if the continent is on track to end its dependency on foreign aid. I think at this moment, what I would like to do is allow our panelists one final engagement. And the question that I have to all of you, this is the subject that we started off with. Are we on the road towards the end of aid in Africa? And I'll start with you.
You know, aid has its place, but let's not give it more value than it has for us. I think the central question for us in Africa is about governance. And the elephant in the room is the resources that our governments have. And the huge unpredictable factor in Africa is the fact that half our population is under 20 today. And by 2050, we are sitting with 2 billion people in this continent. And the vast majority are between 18 and 35. And right now, they do not believe that the political or economic system includes them. They feel marginalized, they are angry, they are restless, and they're demanding a say in how governance happens in this continent and how value is appropriated in a way that makes the lives of all citizens equal.
Well, I think the fundamental issue is to place Africa on a new trajectory of development, which is going to be much more value addition, much more employment created, much more capable of supporting a higher standard of living for its people. I think that if that and when we start to make progress down that, aid will become progressively less important. I doubt that aid will have much role in placing us on that growth path. That will be our task, and I think aid will continue at best to play some sort of a minor role in improving the lot of some relatively small part of our population, as it always has done. And has never done any more than that.
Well, I have to say that the African continent is very diverse. There are countries that are today in need of aid much more than others. And particular countries emerging from conflict still need a lot of support, both from the other African countries and from other better-to-do countries to balance their budgets to get themselves up. And there are others that are more stable, but that are challenged in serious ways in terms of building their institutions, raising domestic resources, and getting on the path of being autonomous economically. So there will be a need to maximize resources from all sources, whether they are development loans or grants or climate funds or whatever sources of financing. We must maximize them, including aid resources. But ultimately, our end goal is for this continent to become economically independent. Our political independence is not meaningful without economic independence. So aid, we must continue to use it more effectively in a targeted way to help us get ourselves out of economic dependence.
For most of the continent, we have a small window. We don't know how long it will last. And that window rests on China and others still consuming natural resources. It may last 5 years. It may last 10 years. No, we don't know for sure. But either way, commodity prices don't always go. They have the knack of going up and down. So we are on the top at the moment. Whilst we have a source of earning some more money, the task is to get a better share of the natural resource rent as the first one, which may suggest, and this is a question of regional integration, a collective effort to support a serious reopening of many of the natural resources contracts. They are all very similar. They were all negotiated on a template supported, helped developed by the World Bank. So the question of getting a fairer share of the rent is the first task, whilst it still lasts. And the second is channeling that rent to the question of transforming the economy into a productive or value-added process. And that's the new role of the state, being developmental. But for most countries, it's very much dependent now on how we manage that rent. The third is understanding the total economy around natural resources and developing those from the services sector to the downstream value additions that can be made, which is not necessarily directly beneficiation of the mineral, but the entire economy surrounding the mineral. This is the pace for most countries that are at the moment not diversified. And in that process, your point about illicit financial flows becomes very important, because from the data, there are two major sources of large-scale outflows. One is natural resources. This is why North Africa and South Africa lead, and Nigeria, 3, lead in the illicit outflows of capital from this continent. Most of it is natural resources. The second is trade mispricing of all other goods, which is transfer mispricing for that. That is a complex process to handle on the trading side and requires international cooperation, in particular addressing tax havens. And I just wanted to end by saying, although again the pace is slow on the illicit capital flows thing, there is a high-level panel set up by the African Union to address this. The chair of this high-level panel is South Africa's former president, Mbeki. Now that Sudan is calming down, maybe you should put pressure on him to pay attention to the illicit financial flows agenda.
Thank you very much.
That's a good one.
Well, that was the second part of our dialogue on foreign aid, which we held in Cape Town recently. And indeed, that discussion was made possible by a kind contribution and in partnership that we developed with Oxfam International here on Africa 360. Now, the question arising from that debate is, what is the main reason that Africa is unable to feed itself? Well, according to Oxfam International's Executive Director, Winnie Byanyima, as you've heard in that panel discussion earlier on, one of those issues that arises the continent's inability to make the best use of its vast mineral wealth. Join us after the break, because when we come back, I'll be joined by a guest to discuss Africa's chances of utilizing those resources, those mineral resources in particular, more effectively, and to break the cycle of foreign aid dependency. And that's happening only on Africa 360. So do join us after the break. Welcome back to Africa 360. Our focus today is on foreign aid and how it affects the continent. I'm now joined in studio by Dr. Claude Kabemba from the Southern Africa Resource Watch. Dr. Kabemba, as you saw from the panel discussion that we had that was brought to us by Oxfam, we had the director of Oxfam, Winnie Byanyima, lamenting the fact that foreign multinational companies come to Africa and they seem to be exempt in many cases from taxes. And she calls this tax holidays. Does this account for some of the lack of returns that a lot of African countries have failed to derive from mineral wealth?
Look, it's one big part of space where Africa is losing its revenues.
Yep.
And you need to contextualize it. I think in the 80s, when it was difficult for Africa to attract foreign direct investment, the rest of the world, the West, in fact, position foreign direct investment as a very important factor for Africa if it has to develop.
Yeah.
And they push Africa to open up its market. When they say to Africa, give us a conducive climate for investment, they are saying, please give us free access to your market.
Let's bring up a graphic here which gives us a sense of how Africa contributes to the world mineral markets. As you can see right at the bottom there, 75% of all platinum that is produced globally come from South Africa. And we're not joking here. Look at the Democratic Republic of Congo. 66% of the world's cobalt comes out of that country. Diamond gems with Botswana at 22%, 5% of titanium coming from Mozambique. And of course, this just gives you a sense of how, in actual fact, Africa does contribute to mineral wealth. But look, let's look at another graphic that also gives us another sense of, where the largest mineral producers in terms of revenue, where they are. And yet again, South Africa is number one. Angola and Nigeria, they produce a lot of oil. In actual fact, it's believed that possibly Angola might overtake Nigeria in terms of oil production. And of course, we've got Algeria and Egypt. But even having this map up, that gives us a sense about it. Just talk to us about how little has been done really to derive a process of beneficiation, which is essentially not just exporting these minerals, but deriving more in terms of the value chain in Africa.
Look, when you take the production of oil, we do not have refineries on this continent.
Yeah.
We produce enough oil to service the continent, but most of African countries import oil.
They import petrol,
processed petrol,
petroleum hydrocarbons.
Exactly, and that demonstrates how we have been not thinking strategically on how to utilize our resources. The value addition is the only option we have on the African continent to start benefiting from our resources. And we need to look into the entire mineral business chain, from downstream to upstream and side stream.
But look, this is not rocket science that you're telling us now. You're talking about essentially we need to add value to a lot of these minerals that we produce on the African continent. So why, first of all, aren't government, secondly, maybe the private sector engaged in such activity?
Look, South Africa has come up with a policy of beneficiation, but mining companies are reluctant to invest in beneficiations. They are saying we are in business of extracting minerals. We are not in business of putting up plants to transform these minerals. If you want to transform, you need to bring in other investors. And you know, bringing other investors, you start to challenge the transformation plant in Europe. And there will be losses of jobs in Europe. So what we need to do is how do we create skills within this continent to start transforming these minerals on this continent? And that's a challenge.
But what, therefore, is the solution to make countries reduce this developmental gap and ensure that these revenues derived from mineral resources can actually be brought back to the people of those countries?
While we have external and internal factors, causes that impede on our ability to benefit from these minerals, the internal factors play a much bigger. The problem in the Congo, as it is for many other countries on this continent, is governance. And governance with its three pillars of accountability, transparency, and participation. We have to ensure that those who are in power with us to rule over our resources are responding to our inquiries, that are transparent, that can give us the information we want to understand how they are running the business of our minerals. We also need people to participate in policy decision and implementation so that people can understand and follow through what is happening.
Indeed, we are the drivers of the change that we want to see on the African continent. In actual fact, what Dr. Kabemba actually diagnoses and says is the solution is for us to make our leaders more accountable and, more importantly, to effect the kind of development returns that we would like to see in the continent. It's a tough indictment, particularly considering the closed nature of some of our government systems on the African continent. That brings us to the end of yet another edition of Africa 360. If you'd like to leave a comment, you can certainly do so by going to our Facebook, or you can indeed join us on Twitter, or you can drop us an email on africa360@enca.com. And just as we wind up, I'd like to thank Dr. Kabemba for having been our guest here on Africa 360. Would also like to once again thank Oxfam International for having organized this two-part series on dialogues on development, which are very important in contextualizing the aid challenges that face our continent. I hope you've also enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. If you'd like to leave a comment, as usual, you can go to those profiles that I gave you earlier on. And remember, if you'd like to see Africa like you've never seen it before, be sure to watch us next time on Africa 360. Take care.